My name is Francis Dalton. I'm 81 years old and I live alone in a narrow brick house on the south side of Chicago. The same house my father bought with a GI loan after returning from the war. It has 3 bedrooms, cracked linoleum in the kitchen, and a creaky stairwell that whines every time I go up to bed. My wife, Eleanor, used to call it our little castle, though in the last decade of her life she mostly stayed in the downstairs bedroom we converted when the stairs got too much for her knees. She passed 6 years ago, in the spring. I remember the azaleas blooming outside her window, that pale pink blur she could see from her hospice bed. The nurse said she left peacefully in her sleep, holding my hand even though I'd dozed off in the chair beside her. I've never quite forgiven myself for not being awake at that final moment, though I know, rationally, there was nothing else I could have done. What followed was a silence I still haven't managed to fill. Our only child, my son, Rick, was at her funeral, though he arrived late and left early. He said work at the firm was swamping him. He's a software engineer or consultant or something of that nature. I stopped understanding the titles a long time ago. He lives in Naperville now, some 40 miles away, in a sleek white-walled house with open-concept everything and a refrigerator that tells you when the milk is low. I've been there a few times, mostly birthdays for my grandson Connor when he was little. The last time was Christmas, 2 years back. I was invited, technically, but by the end of the evening I'd felt more like a piece of elderly furniture, present, politely acknowledged, and then quietly ignored. They'd talk about TV shows I'd never heard of, office politics, new car leases, and vacation plans to Costa Rica or the Caymans. I tried to chime in once or twice, told a story about when Eleanor and I had driven down Route 66 in a Buick with no air conditioning. Rick smiled like someone indulging a nursing home resident and then steered the conversation back to electric vehicles. Connor, now a sullen teenager, mostly stayed on his phone. Still, I held on. I kept calling, writing little notes, forwarding articles I thought Rick might find interesting, pieces about technology, aging, or economics. I don't know if he ever read them. He rarely responded, and when he did, it was with the one-line texts. Thanks, Dad, or cool. But I kept trying because I was his father and because I had already lost enough. The only real connection I maintained was with a handful of old friends. Men from church, neighbors, army buddies, and 2 former colleagues from the city's permit office, where I worked for 37 years before retiring. Every evening, as a kind of ritual, I would flip open my battered old flip phone, scroll through the names, and call 1 or 2 of them. Sometimes we'd talk for 10 minutes, sometimes longer. It wasn't always a deep conversation, but it grounded me. Made me feel like I was still tethered to something, someone. About a year ago, that began to change. First, it was George from the American Legion Hall. Died in his sleep, his son told me when I called. Then Frank from the neighborhood association stopped answering. A few weeks later, his daughter texted me from his number. He'd had a stroke, couldn't talk anymore. That left Harold and Ed, my 2 remaining lifelines. Then Harold moved to Florida to live with his niece, and Ed's daughter put him in a memory care unit in Des Plaines. When I called the facility, they said he couldn't take phone calls anymore. And just like that, the list of people who knew me, really knew me, shrank to almost nothing. Rick noticed. One afternoon he came by, unannounced. He brought Connor, who sat on my couch the whole time playing a game on his phone with the sound off. Rick said I needed a new phone, said it was unsafe for someone my age to be fumbling with a 10-year-old flip model. I protested, of course, said I liked my phone just fine, knew where everything was, had all my numbers stored. But he insisted, told me not to worry that all the contacts would be transferred. I didn't argue much after that. Maybe part of me wanted to believe he was finally paying attention. He took the phone, said he'd back everything up, and bring me a new one next week. A week turned into 2, then 3. I called him on the house line. He'd stopped answering. Finally, one Saturday morning, he arrived with a new device. It was flat, black, and gleamed like a mirror. a touchscreen model with icons and gestures I didn't understand. He spent 20 minutes showing me how to swipe, tap, and hold. Then he handed it to me and left. "Everything you need is there," he said, and was gone before I could ask about my contacts. That evening, when I sat down in my armchair, intending to call Ed out of habit even though I knew he wouldn't answer, I opened the Contacts app and found it empty. Blank. Not a single name or number. At first, I assumed it was a mistake, a glitch. Maybe I'd hit the wrong icon. I tried again, then again. Nothing. I felt a strange, rising panic. Not because I couldn't make a call, but because it felt like someone had taken an eraser to my life. These names were more than phone numbers. They were the last threads of memory, of identity, of witness. And now they were gone. I called Rick the next morning from the house phone. He answered on the third ring. When I told him about the contacts, he said, "You didn't really need most of them anymore, Dad. Half those guys are gone. It's just clutter. Now it's clean, simple. You'll get used to it." I sat in silence, trying to form a reply. "Besides," he added, "if you need anyone, you can always call me." But that was the point. He was the one person I couldn't call. Not really. Not with trust. Not with love. Not anymore. That afternoon, I sat with the new phone in my hand, scrolling through nothing. I went upstairs and pulled out a dusty old Rolodex from Eleanor's desk drawer. Most of the cards were yellowed, names smudged, some scratched out. But there, near the front, was one card with neat black ink, the numbers underlined twice. Raymond M. Pritchard, my oldest friend from the Army. We hadn't spoken in over a decade. I didn't even know if he was still alive. But I had memorized that number long ago. It was a habit from before phones remembered things for us. With trembling fingers, I dialed. And to my astonishment, someone answered. The voice on the other end of the line was raspy, hesitant at first, like someone not used to answering unfamiliar numbers. I cleared my throat and said, "Ray." "Ray Pritchard?" There was a long pause. I could hear the ambient sounds of a TV somewhere in the background, muffled voices from a talk show, then the soft scrape of a chair. And then I heard it, low, drawn out, uncertain. "Francis?" That single word, with all its age and memory and disbelief, hit me like a gust of wind through a long-closed window. I hadn't heard my name spoken like that in years, not with that mix of recognition and warmth, like I wasn't just some elderly man shuffling through the end of his days, but someone who had once mattered, once lived, once been seen. "Yeah," I said, trying not to let my voice crack. "It's me." Another pause. "Well, I'll be damned. I thought you'd—" He didn't finish the sentence, and I didn't need him to. I knew exactly how it would have ended. The last time we'd spoken had been maybe 15 years ago, right after Eleanor's first hip surgery. After that, life got in the way. Phone calls grew less frequent. Holiday cards went unanswered. We both let the silence settle between us, too proud or too tired to dig back through it. We talked for almost an hour. His wife had passed too. His daughter lived in Oregon and called sometimes, but mostly he kept to himself, puttered around the house, watched old movies. He hadn't been well lately, heart issues mostly, but his mind was sharp, and he remembered things I had forgotten. Details about our time at Fort Dix, the cigarettes we used to sneak behind the mess tent, the girl from the diner in Trenton we both tried to charm. We laughed. We actually laughed. It felt so strange and natural that I almost didn't recognize the sound at first. When I hung up, my hand was trembling, not with age this time, but with something close to hope. The call with Ray cracked something open in me. I began scouring drawers, files, any place I might have tucked away a scrap of a number, an address, a name. I wanted to rebuild my list, reconnect with the fragments of a life I thought had been quietly buried. But the more I searched, the more I realized how much had already been lost. Half the numbers I found were disconnected. Others led to relatives who coolly informed me that the person I was looking for had passed, years ago in some cases. One woman hung up after curtly saying, "He died, sir," like I was an inconvenience for even calling. I tried not to take it personally. Still, I managed to piece together a few connections. A distant cousin in Kansas City, a former co-worker who was now in assisted living. Each small rediscovery felt like a victory, a spark of something real in the gray quiet of my days. I jotted them down in a new paper notebook, one I kept in my shirt pocket like a talisman. I didn't trust the phone anymore, not after what Rick had done. In the days that followed, the implications of that wiped contact list began to settle into something darker. I started to notice other changes. My digital calendar, once synced with reminders for doctor visits, pension deposits, utility bills, was empty. The saved notes where I had written medication schedules, birthdays, even little bits of poetry I used to read to Eleanor, were gone. All gone. At first I wondered if the phone had malfunctioned, or if in my ignorance of technology I had accidentally deleted things. But I wasn't stupid. I had spent years managing city contracts, navigating bureaucratic systems, budgeting and planning. I might be old, but I was not senile. Then came the day when I received a letter from my bank stating that someone had inquired about obtaining power of attorney for my accounts. It was unsigned, merely informational, sent as a courtesy. When I called the branch to inquire, the manager, a woman named Carla who had known me for over a decade, said, "It was your son, Mr. Dalton. Rick. He came in last Tuesday asking what documentation he would need if, hypothetically, you were unable to manage your affairs." She paused, as if trying to choose her words carefully. We told him we'd need to see a medical diagnosis confirming cognitive decline or incapacity. He said he'd follow up. "Is everything all right, sir?" I told her yes, thank you, everything was fine, and I hung up. But everything was not fine. That night, I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it click with every turn, and thought about Rick's visit, the way he had insisted on taking my phone, his smile, his casual dismissal of my concerns. It hadn't been care, it hadn't even been concern. It was premeditation. He had wiped me clean, not just my contacts, but my record, my schedule, my tools of independence. He was laying the groundwork for something, and I knew, deep in my bones, that whatever it wasn't about love. 2 days later, I received a call from my pharmacy informing me that someone had requested to switch my prescription delivery to a different address, Rick's address. They asked if I had moved. I told them no and demanded they reverse the change. The pharmacist sounded nervous, like she didn't want to be involved. "We just follow the forms we receive," she said. "It was signed by your son, and it included a note that said you were staying with him for the foreseeable future." That was the moment the doubt died. I stopped wondering whether this was all in my head. I began to understand the full shape of what Rick was doing. He wasn't just isolating me. He was replacing me, with a narrative, with paperwork, with quiet manipulations no one would question because I was an old man, and he was my son. The more I resisted, the more it would look like confusion. And the more confused I seemed, the more plausible his case would be. I confronted him the following Sunday. He had stopped by, as he sometimes did, unannounced and always on his own terms. He walked into the kitchen with a bag of groceries, fancy almond milk, low-sodium crackers, things I never asked for, and started putting them away like he was doing me a favor. I waited until he finished and said, "Rick, why did you erase my phone? Why are you changing my pharmacy records?" He turned, looked at me, and said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "Dad, you're being paranoid. No one's trying to hurt you. I'm just trying to help. You forget things. It's not safe for you to manage all this alone anymore." "I forget things? Like what?" I asked. He hesitated. "You forgot Connor's birthday last month. You called me 3 times in one day asking the same question about your insurance. I forgot Connor's birthday, I repeated slowly, because no one told me when the party was. And I asked about insurance because you never answered the first time. Rick raised his hands. Okay. Maybe it's a misunderstanding, but the point is, you're getting older. You need support. That's all I'm saying. Support. That word. It stung in a way he probably didn't intend. It sounded like pity laced with control. I saw the glint in his eye, not of cruelty but of resolve. He believed he was doing the right thing. Or, at least, he needed to believe it, so he could sleep at night. I was becoming a problem to be solved, not a father to be respected. That night I called Ray again. I told him everything, about the phone, the bank, the pharmacy. He listened quietly. Then he said, "Francis, it's happening everywhere. My niece tried the same thing after my last hospital stay. Said she just wanted to make sure my finances were in order. Next thing I know, she's calling the mortgage company behind my back. You have to be careful. People see age, and they think it means weakness." I sat there in the dark, clutching the phone, and said, "I think my son is trying to erase me, Ray." And Ray said, "Then you better remember who you are before he finishes the job." Over the following weeks, something in the house began to change. Something subtle at first, like the quality of silence shifting, becoming heavier, more deliberate. I would walk into rooms and find lights that I was sure I had turned off now inexplicably on, faucets dripping when I was certain they had been closed tight, drawers slightly ajar that I hadn't opened in days. I started questioning myself, wondering if maybe Rick was right, maybe I really was slipping in some small way. But then came the day I found a pile of unopened mail stuffed beneath the cushion of my armchair. Bank statements, utility bills, and a hospital invoice for lab work I hadn't done. All of them had my name. All of them redirected to Rick's address with notes in his handwriting. Forward to son. Handle through POA. My hands trembled as I picked them up one by one. He was slowly migrating my life out from under me, like someone quietly stealing the floorboards from a house while the occupant slept. That same week, my Medicare provider called to confirm changes made to my emergency contact and authorized representative. "Your son said you requested it," the operator told me. "We're just verifying your consent." My voice was calm, almost eerily so when I told her I had made no such request and would be rescinding those changes immediately. I could hear her uncertainty, an undercurrent of doubt in her tone. "We'll need to see an ID and signature," she said carefully, "and if there's any conflict, we may need documentation from a physician to verify mental capacity." It was a phrase that had begun to haunt me. Mental capacity. As if my very ability to tell my own story, to define my own life, now required certification from a stranger with a clipboard. That night I pulled out a small box from the closet, Eleanor's old keepsake tin where she used to keep our marriage license, insurance papers, and old postcards from vacations long past. I added to it every document I could think of. My birth certificate, driver's license, Army discharge papers, pension letters, everything with my name and signature. I labeled it in bold marker, Francis Dalton. In case of emergency, do not trust anyone without this. It felt absurd and deeply necessary all at once. Rick's visits became more frequent, but they felt less like family calls and more like inspections. He started showing up unannounced, letting himself in with the key I'd given him 20 years ago during Eleanor's first surgery. At first, I'd been grateful for his help, for the groceries he brought, the quick repairs he'd do around the house, the occasional ride to the clinic. But now, every gesture felt loaded, conditional, like it came with fine print I hadn't signed. He began leaving sticky notes around the house. "Remember your blood pressure meds? Don't forget trash day. Try to eat more greens." I didn't need reminders. I had my routines. But the notes weren't for reminders. They were exhibits. Proof that he was managing me, monitoring my state. The worst part was that he spoke to me more and more like I was a stranger, always a half smile, a slightly elevated tone, like you use with someone who's hard of hearing or slow. He'd ask the same questions twice, then make a note on his phone when I repeated the same answer. Once, I saw the screen. He had a folder titled Dad, Cognitive Log. I didn't confront him, not then. Instead, I waited until he left, then sat down at the kitchen table with Eleanor's old crossword puzzle book and solved 3 of them back to back, just to reassure myself that my mind was still mine. Then came the moment that made everything snap into focus. It was a Saturday afternoon in late March. The ground was still frozen, but the air had started to soften. Spring coming in timid and late. I was outside raking the last of the winter debris from the backyard when a man approached me from the alley. He was in his 30s, dressed in casual business wear, holding a clipboard and an envelope. "Mr. Dalton?" he asked, polite but wary. "I'm James Carlisle, from South Shore Social Services. Your son asked us to come by for an in-home evaluation." I stared at him, not comprehending. "Evaluation for what?" I asked, though deep down I already knew. He shifted his weight. "Just standard protocol when a family member raises concerns about independent living capacity. I'm here to observe your living conditions, make some assessments. Nothing formal unless we determine that—" I didn't let him finish. I took the envelope from his hand and ripped it in half in front of him. "You can tell my son that if he has concerns, he can come speak to me directly like a man. I don't need to be observed like a specimen." The young man nodded slowly, clearly used to resistance, and then to his credit apologized. "I understand, sir. We'll note your refusal. Have a good day." He walked back down the alley and disappeared around the corner. Inside, I poured myself a glass of water and stared out the kitchen window. The maple tree Eleanor had planted in the yard years ago was starting to bud, small green nubs forming along the branches. I remembered how she used to tap the window and say, "Look, Frank, it's waking up again." That tree had come back every spring, as predictable as sunrise. But what was happening now, this slow erasure of my agency, this campaign of quiet displacement, this was not natural, not inevitable. It was manufactured, calculated, and unfolding in real time. I needed to act. The next day, I drove to the courthouse and requested forms to revoke any standing medical or financial permissions given to Rick. The clerk was helpful but skeptical. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked. "You'll need to list someone else as emergency contact." I nodded and wrote down Ray's name and number. "He's an old friend," I said. "A real one." I mailed the updated forms to my doctor, my pharmacy, and the Medicare office. Then I changed the locks on the house. It felt symbolic more than anything. Rick hadn't used his key in years until this year, and now he wouldn't be able to again. But the moment I turned that lock, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Control. Fragile, fleeting, but mine. A few days later, Rick called. His voice was tight, brittle. "I stopped by and couldn't get in. You changed the locks?" I told him yes. "Without telling me?" he asked, voice rising. I paused. Why would I tell someone who's trying to build a case against me? There was silence. Then he said, "You're being irrational, Dad. You're going to end up hurting yourself, or worse. And when that happens, no one's going to be able to help you." I almost laughed. "You mean no one will be able to control me?" He didn't reply. Then he hung up. That evening, I wrote a long letter to Ray. I told him everything I hadn't said on the phone. The creeping dread, the visits, the social services guy, the bank calls, the feeling that my own son was treating me like an expired license. Ray called the next day. "Frank," he said, "you need to get ahead of this. Before he finds a doctor willing to say what he wants to hear, before the paperwork starts moving behind your back, His voice was firm. You need to leave a record. Make statements. Dates. Witnesses. Hell, videotape yourself reading the paper. Anything that proves you're still in control. I took his advice. I bought a notebook and started logging everything. Every phone call, every letter, every strange interaction. I spoke with a lawyer downtown who specialized in elder rights and told her everything. She was cautious, but sympathetic. "Unfortunately, this isn't rare," she said. "We call it social erasure. Happens quietly. Starts with small changes. Then one day, you're institutionalized and no one questions it. You're wise to act now." She helped me draft a letter formally revoking all prior powers of attorney. We had it notarized, filed, and sent copies to the relevant institutions. Then she said something that stuck with me. "The only real power you have now, Mr. Dalton, is preparation. If he's planning something, beat him to it." By the end of that week, I had also transferred a portion of my savings into a separate account under a new bank, one that Rick had no knowledge of. I left a letter with my lawyer stating my full mental fitness and listed specific wishes in the event of hospitalization, including a ban on Rick making decisions without a court order. I also recorded a video, just as Ray had suggested, reading aloud from the day's newspaper, discussing current events, describing the route I took to the grocery store. It felt performative and absurd, but when I watched it back, I saw something in my own eyes I hadn't noticed in months. Resolve. The erasure was no longer silent. It was real, visible, and I was no longer waiting to be the last one to notice. I didn't expect to hear from Connor, not really. Our conversations had always been surface level at best, the kind of polite exchanges that happen at family gatherings when a teenager is forced to say hello to someone he barely knows. But then, one evening, as I was pouring myself a cup of tea and watching the rain flick against the kitchen window, my cell phone lit up with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer. Too many robocalls and scams lately. But something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was quiet, hesitant. "Grandpa." It took me a second to place the voice. "Connor," I said, heart suddenly lifting in spite of itself. "Yeah," he replied, almost apologetically. "Listen, I probably shouldn't be calling you, but I saw something, and I don't know. I just thought you should know." I sat down slowly. "Go ahead, son." He hesitated. "Dad's been saying stuff. To Mom. To some lawyer, I think. He's saying you're confused all the time, that you don't remember where you are sometimes, that you called him twice last week and didn't know it was him." I stayed silent, letting him talk. "It's not true, right?" he added, almost like he was asking himself. "I mean, you're okay, aren't you?" I told him the truth. I said that yes, I was getting older, and yes, sometimes I forgot things like where I put my glasses or which day the garbage pickup was, but I was not losing myself. I told him that his father was trying to take over my life and that I wasn't going to let it happen. There was another pause. "I thought he was helping," Connor said, softer now. "He said you couldn't take care of yourself. But then I saw him going through some papers in your desk. He had keys. Mom asked him if it was really necessary and he just said, 'You'll thank me later.'" My grip on the phone tightened. I thanked Connor for calling me and told him that he didn't need to get involved further if he felt unsafe or unsure. "Just don't let them make you doubt what you see," I said, "even if they say it's for someone's own good." He promised he wouldn't. That call left me both heartened and rattled. On one hand, it proved that not everyone in my family had turned away from me, and that perhaps the cycle of control and silence might be interrupted. On the other, it confirmed what I had suspected. Rick was accelerating his efforts. Whatever he was planning, he intended to do it soon. 2 days later, I came home from a walk to find my back door ajar. Nothing was stolen, nothing broken, but several things were out of place. The drawer where I kept my insurance papers was half open, the folder with my property deed had been moved, and my spare key, the one taped behind the kitchen radiator, was Missing. I called the locksmith that same night. When I asked if he could come immediately, he didn't even hesitate. "Happens more often than you think," he said as he changed the locks, his tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. "Kids or siblings think they know what's best, sneak in, take over. I did a whole security upgrade for a lady whose niece tried to sell her condo while she was in the hospital." That night, I barely slept. I lay awake, the new keys under my pillow, the hallway light on, every creak of the old house sounding like a threat. I had lived there for nearly 50 years and never felt unsafe. Until now. The next morning, a thick envelope arrived by certified mail. Inside was a letter from Rick's attorney, a man I had never heard of, informing me that my son had petitioned the court for temporary conservatorship due to concerns about my diminished capacity. Attached was a stack of documents, forms, statements, even an affidavit from some physician I'd never met who had supposedly conducted a remote cognitive assessment based on second-hand information. My chest tightened as I read the words, confused, agitated, mentally impaired. It was like reading the eulogy of a man who was still very much alive. I called my lawyer immediately. She read the documents, asked a few pointed questions, then said, "We're going to challenge this, and we're going to win." But even with her confidence, I felt something inside me begin to shake. Not just fear, but betrayal at a level that words couldn't quite reach. I thought back to the day Eleanor and I had brought Rick home from the hospital, how she had cried with joy holding that tiny, swaddled body against her chest, how I had paced the nursery floor at night singing lullabies off-key, promising him I'd always be there. I thought about helping him with his school projects, cheering at his baseball games, driving him to college in our old Chevy with the trunk full of second-hand luggage. I remembered how proud I'd been when he got his first job, how I'd sent him money during that rough patch after the tech crash, how I'd opened the joint account he used for years without ever once asking questions. And now that same son was trying to render me legally voiceless. He had taken everything I had given him and decided it wasn't enough. He needed my dignity too. I spent the next week gathering every bit of evidence I could find. Doctor's notes, dated medication logs, notarized letters from friends and neighbors who had seen me regularly. My lawyer arranged an independent evaluation with a geriatric psychiatrist, a woman with kind eyes and a razor-sharp mind. After 2 hours of tests, conversation, and memory recall, she looked at me and said, "Mr. Dalton, you are not only competent, you are astoundingly lucid for your age. Whatever is happening here, it's not about your mind. It's about control." I nodded, not surprised, but hearing it aloud gave me a strange mix of validation and sorrow. What Rick hadn't anticipated was that I would fight. He had expected, perhaps, that I would go quietly, that I'd be too confused or scared or ashamed to push back. He had underestimated me, and maybe in some ways I had underestimated myself, too. Because what I felt wasn't just anger, it was clarity. A line had been crossed. I would not spend the rest of my life as a ghost in my own home. And if it meant tearing open every hidden motive, every lie, every carefully placed piece of evidence he'd stacked against me, then so be it. He would learn, in the end, that I was still here, that I had not forgotten who I was, and that no one, not even my son, would write my ending without a fight. The hearing was set for late April, a date that landed with a thud in the middle of my calendar, circled twice in red ink like a wound I needed to keep checking. My lawyer, Ms. Avella, had warned me that Rick's team would try to delay, manipulate, redirect. She called it the slow suffocation tactic. Stretch the proceedings until the elder gives up or dies of stress. But I was not in the mood to die, and even less inclined to surrender. In the days leading up to the hearing, I doubled down. I kept logs of everything, every phone call, every transaction, every conversation overheard through thin walls. I began to suspect that Rick was watching the house. One evening, returning from the pharmacy, I noticed a dark-colored sedan parked 2 blocks down with a figure sitting in it, engine idling. It didn't move when I approached, but when I re-emerged 10 minutes later, it was gone. Whether it was paranoia or surveillance, I couldn't say, but I started drawing the blinds earlier, and I left a note on the mailbox for the postman to hand-deliver any legal correspondence, no matter how minor. Then came the moment when Rick stopped pretending. A letter arrived not from his lawyer, but from him directly, in his own hand, written with a careful formality that tried, and failed, to conceal the seething beneath the surface. He opened with concern, words like, only doing what's best and trying to protect you, but within 3 paragraphs the tone shifted. He accused me of endangering myself by living alone, of hoarding documents that should be co-managed, of refusing the help any reasonable father would welcome. He mentioned my age 6 times in a single page. He referred to my recent withdrawals from the bank as erratic behavior, and my calls to Connor as emotional manipulation. But the worst line was this: at this point I am forced to act on behalf of the greater good, even if it puts strain on our relationship. You may not see it now, but one day you'll thank me. I read that line 3 times and felt my heart ache in a way it hadn't since Eleanor's final morning. Thank him. For what? For taking away my freedom? For rewriting the story of my decline before it had even begun? That same day, I received a voicemail from a caseworker at a facility I had never heard of, informing me that they were in the process of evaluating an intake application in my name. She was polite, professional, and deeply mistaken. I called her back immediately. That's impossible, I said. I've submitted no such application. She apologized, said the paperwork came from a relative, my son, and included some preliminary documentation, including a falsified letter from a doctor. I demanded copies of everything. What I received 3 days later was a collection of pure fiction. A claim that I had wandered outside late at night in my pajamas, that I had forgotten my own address twice, that I had confused the names of my medications and had been seen talking to the television. These were not misinterpretations. They were deliberate, fabricated attempts to paint me as unfit. I sat at my desk, reading these lies, and felt something shift inside me. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was furious. I called Connor. I asked if he remembered seeing me disoriented, forgetful, confused. He said no, of course not. I told him about the paperwork, the claim that I was losing touch with reality. He was silent for a long time, then whispered, "He told Mom you left the stove on and almost started a fire, but when I checked, there wasn't even a burner warm." I thanked him. I didn't ask him to take sides, I just asked him to remember what he saw. He said he would. I hoped that would be enough. The weekend before the hearing, Rick showed up at my door uninvited. He rang the bell 3 times in quick succession, a rhythm he used to use as a boy when coming home from school. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. He stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, dressed in a dark blue suit like he was heading to a funeral. He looked thinner than I remembered, more brittle. "Can we talk?" he asked. I stepped outside and shut the door behind me. "We're already talking," I replied. He sighed. "It doesn't have to be like this, Dad. You're making things worse." I said nothing. He continued. "Look, I know you think I'm the enemy right now, but I'm trying to take care of things. You've been unpredictable." I raised an eyebrow. "Unpredictable?" "You're isolating," he said. "You're rejecting support. That's dangerous. You could fall. You could forget your meds. You could wind up in the hospital. Then what?" I smiled faintly. "Then I'd call an ambulance, like any adult would." He didn't appreciate the sarcasm. "We don't have to go to court," he said. "We could settle this quietly. If you agree to give me temporary conservatorship, just until we're sure everything's stable, I'll drop the case." I stared at him. my own son, a man who once held my hand on the way to kindergarten, now offering to buy my dignity with legal technicalities. "You want me to sign away my life?" I said flatly. "No," he said too quickly. "I want to ensure your safety." I shook my head. "No, Rick. You want to ensure your control." And then I stepped back inside and closed the door. The hearing was held via video call, something that seemed both absurd and deeply modern. I wore a jacket and tie, sat in front of Eleanor's old hutch, and tried to appear composed. Mins. Avella sat beside me, just off camera, ready with documents and references. Rick was in a brightly lit office somewhere, his lawyer beside him, both of them speaking in soft, reasonable tones that made my skin crawl. The judge was polite but tired-looking. Clearly someone used to wading through the murk of family disputes. Rick's attorney opened with a monologue about concern, generational responsibility, and the fragility of independent aging. He used phrases like gentle supervision and supportive oversight. When it was my turn, Ms. Avella presented medical reports, letters from my neighbors, and a notarized statement from Ray. I spoke only briefly. "Your Honor," I said, "being old is not a crime. Forgetting a date or misplacing a phone is not evidence of incompetence. My son is not trying to protect me. He is trying to replace me, and I refuse to vanish quietly." There was a pause after I finished. I watched the judge lean back in his chair, rub his temple, and nod slowly. The ruling came 2 days later. Conservatorship denied. No evidence of incapacity. No further hearings necessary. It was a win, and yet it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. But Rick wasn't done. Days later, I discovered that the joint bank account I had kept open for emergencies had been accessed. Illegally, according to the bank manager. Someone using my son's credentials had attempted to transfer funds to an unknown account. The bank froze the transaction, flagged it for fraud, and notified me. I went in the next morning, closed the account, and requested a new set of access credentials. "Your son has power of attorney?" the teller asked. "Not anymore," I replied. That evening, I walked through the house and saw it differently. It no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stage where every object might be weaponized against me. An old prescription bottle, an expired driver's license, a sticky note with handwriting that could be twisted into evidence. I decided then that I was done playing defense. It was time to act. I contacted a realtor the next morning. I began the process of selling the house. My plan wasn't just to escape, it was to erase the trail. I would move, I would change my number. I would remove every anchor Rick could grab hold of. I began packing that week, boxing up photos, letters, records. I kept only what mattered: Eleanor's letters, Ray's number, and my notebooks. The rest I gave away, donated, or burned. Rick called twice in the days that followed. I didn't answer. He sent an email, long, accusatory, filled with legal threats and thinly veiled pleas. I read it once, then deleted it. The next week, I moved into a small apartment on the north side, a quiet building near the lake. No one there knew me. No one called me anything but Mr. Dalton. I told the realtor to finalize the sale without me present. I didn't even keep a forwarding address. The erasure Rick had attempted had failed. But in its place, I had created a silence of my own, a deliberate one. And in that silence, I could finally hear myself again. No static, no surveillance, no performance. Just me, alone, intact, and finally, truly unobserved. It was on a Wednesday morning in early May that the final confrontation came, unannounced and uninvited, just like everything else Rick had done over the past year. I had been sitting by the window of my new apartment, watching an old woman across the courtyard feed breadcrumbs to pigeons from a chipped saucer. The day was overcast, not cold exactly, but the kind of Chicago spring day that refused to make up its mind about being warm or miserable. My tea had gone tepid beside me when there was a loud knock at the door. 3 times, sharp, demanding. I already knew who it would be. I opened it to find Rick standing there, hair disheveled, shirt wrinkled, expression somewhere between desperation and rage. Behind him, barely visible through the hallway light, stood Connor, arms folded across his chest, expression unreadable. "Can I come in?" Rick asked, voice clipped. I stepped aside without a word, not out of invitation but because I didn't want the neighbors to hear what was coming. He walked in quickly, looking around the modest apartment like it was a crime scene. Connor lingered near the doorway, not crossing the threshold. Rick turned to me with eyes that were no longer hiding anything. "You sold the house," he said flatly. I nodded. "You emptied the joint account," he continued. Another nod. "You changed your will." I met his eyes and said, "Yes, I did." He exhaled loudly, a short burst of disbelief and fury. "Why?" he demanded. "Why are you doing this?" "I was trying to help you." I felt something inside me rise. Not anger this time, but a steadiness I hadn't known I still possessed. "You weren't helping," I said. "You were replacing me. You tried to steal my life 1 paper at a time." Rick threw up his hands. "You're paranoid. You've always been suspicious, impossible to please. I should have known you'd turn this into a war." I almost laughed, but the sound didn't come. "A war?" I repeated. "You forged medical reports, tried to have me declared incompetent, filed for conservatorship without telling me, and submitted my name to a facility I've never seen. You broke into my house and moved my papers. And you call me the aggressor?" For a moment he said nothing. His mouth opened, then closed. He turned to Connor. "Tell him," he said. "Tell him he's not thinking clearly." Connor didn't move. "He's thinking more clearly than you," he said quietly. Rick's face contorted then, not just in anger, but something deeper, a kind of betrayal that he didn't expect from his own son. He stepped closer to me, voice lowering into something sharp and intimate. "Do you have any idea what it was like growing up with you?" he said. "You were always so damn self-righteous. Everything had to be your way. You lectured me about everything. Money, school, friends. You never trusted me. Not once." I felt those words like darts, but I didn't flinch. "I trusted you with everything I had," I said. "My home, my finances, my name. I let you take care of things because I believed, deep down, that you still saw me as your father. Not as a burden, not as a wallet, but as a man." Rick shook his head. "You don't get it. You never did. I was trying to get ahead of the inevitable. I didn't want to wait until you burned the house down or got scammed by some telemarketer or fell in the shower and bled out alone. So you decided to take control," I said. "To reframe my forgetfulness as mental decline, my independence as negligence. You didn't ask. You assumed. You stole my name, Rick, and you did it like it was your right. Because I was the only one left," he shouted suddenly. "Mom's gone. You're all I had to take care of. And I was tired of watching you decay and pretend you weren't. I did what needed to be done." The silence that followed that outburst was dense. I looked at him for a long time, seeing the boy he once was and the man he had become overlap in ways that hurt to witness. "You did what benefited you," I said finally. "Don't confuse ambition with altruism." Then Connor stepped forward, voice shaking slightly but firm. "Dad," he said, "you lied to me. You said Grandpa was getting worse, that he was forgetting things, that he was depressed. But I've seen his notebooks. I've heard him talk. He's clearer than you. You made me think he was slipping when you were the one manipulating everything." Rick turned to him, eyes wide with something like panic. "Connor, I was trying to protect you too. You don't understand how hard this has been." "I understand exactly how hard it is," Connor said, "but I also know when someone's being erased in real time. And you erased him." Because you didn't want to deal with what it would mean if he was still capable, and you were just selfish. Rick stared at him, jaw tight, fists balled. He didn't speak. I stood between them and said, "This isn't about capacity anymore. It's about who we become when we think no one is watching. And I've seen who you are now, Rick. I've seen who you chose to be." Rick turned to me, and there was something broken in his expression, something like exhaustion wearing a mask of fury. "You're going to die alone," he said bitterly. "You'll regret this. One day, when no one picks up your calls, when no one visits, when you fall and no one comes, you'll wish you'd let someone care." I felt no rage in response, only a deep, still calm. "I'd rather die alone with my name intact," I said, "than live under the illusion that what you offered me was love." Rick's face twisted once more, then he turned abruptly and walked out the door. Connor lingered for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said, eyes moist. "I should have spoken up sooner." I placed a hand on his shoulder. "You spoke up when it mattered," I said. "That's more than most ever do." When they left, I sat back down at the window. The pigeons were still there, pecking at crumbs, utterly unbothered by the human storm that had just passed. I sipped the cold tea, looked around my small, quiet home, and realized something had lifted. The fight was not over. There would be more battles, maybe more legal letters or retaliations. But the weight, the heavy, choking dread that I would be erased without resistance, was gone. I had not won just a case. I had preserved something elemental. I had reminded myself, and perhaps even my grandson, that identity does not have an expiration date, and that no one, not even family, has the right to declare a man's life finished before he's taken his final breath. It has now been 4 months since that final confrontation, and in that time, something has settled inside me. Not peace exactly, but a sturdier kind of silence, the kind that doesn't come from absence, but from choice. I no longer live with the illusion that family will always protect, or that blood obligates kindness. Rick has not called me since that day, and I have not tried to reach him. The distance between us is now a fact of life, not a wound. I don't check the mail with dread anymore, nor do I jump at unknown numbers flashing across my phone. The world has returned to a slower rhythm, and I have grown accustomed to the quiet. I walk every morning, the same loop around the lakefront, nodding at the same 2 or 3 strangers who've started recognizing me. I buy groceries from a small market where the cashier knows my name and doesn't ask invasive questions. I've joined a library group for older veterans, not because I'm lonely, but because I've decided I will no longer apologize for wanting conversation with people who speak plainly and remember how to listen. Most days I read, I write in my notebook, I listen to music Eleanor once loved. I light a candle for her each Sunday morning. And, once a week, like clockwork, I call Ray. His health is worsening. He knows it, I know it, but he still laughs at my stories, still remembers the names of every man in our platoon, and still says my name like it matters. He's the only person left who remembers me from the time before fatherhood, before mortgages and disappointment and courtrooms. He calls me Frankie, even now, and when he says it, I don't feel old. I feel remembered. As for Connor, he texts now and then. Not much, not enough to call a bond, but there's something beginning to form there, something tentative but real. He asks for book recommendations. He tells me about his exams. Once, he sent a photo of his sketch pad. He'd drawn a picture of a man sitting by a window, watching birds. I didn't ask if it was supposed to be me. I just printed it out and pinned it above my desk. It's the only thing on the wall besides Eleanor's photo. I don't know if he'll keep reaching out. But I know now that the silence between generations doesn't have to be permanent. It can be broken, revoiced, if someone is brave enough to speak truth where others only rehearsed lies. I've updated my will again. It's handwritten this time, signed and sealed in front of a witness at the library. It states clearly, I leave no inheritance to my son, Richard. not out of spite, but because I cannot reward betrayal. What I built with my own hands, my own heart, my own years. Let it pass to someone who believes in names, not signatures. I've also written a letter, an open one, not just for Connor, but for anyone who might one day find themselves in my shoes, standing in a room filled with friendly faces that have begun to close in. It says this: "You are not senile for resisting disappearance. You are not selfish for wanting to live on your terms. You are not paranoid for noticing the ground shifting beneath you. And you are not alone. There are others, quiet and scattered, who have felt the slow hands reaching toward their lives and said firmly, 'No.' I've learned that justice, in the end, is rarely loud. It comes not in verdicts, but in moments. A grandson's gaze, a locked door, a cup of tea sipped in solitude without fear. Justice is being able to tell your story before someone else writes it for you. And now, I have told mine. Tomorrow, I will walk the lake path again, and maybe I'll see the pigeons, or maybe I'll just see the sky reflected in the water, reminding me of everything that's been lost, and everything that's still mine."